Hi everybody. Just to be sure, can everyone see the slide that I've pulled up on the screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So hi, I'm Regina, and I'll let my other colleagues introduce themselves and get the presentation underway. But I just wanted to be sure the slides were up there and that the first order of things is okay.
All right. Hi, I'm Scarlett. I'm also one of the Sesquicentennial Scholars. I think we're good. Jennifer, do you want to get started with the introduction?
Sure. Sorry, I thought we were going to the next slide. I was confused. Okay, I'm Jennifer Duvall. I'm one of the Sesquicentennial Scholars. I work in the University Archives and Special Collections. Yes, I said that already. And Erica Christie was the scholar from Digital Humanities that worked there with me last year.
Yeah, so hi again. I'm Regina and I work in the Women and Leadership Archives. I'm a second-year student in the Masters in Digital Humanities program. I was mainly involved in doing research at the WLA.
I'm Scarlett Andes. I'm a second-year student in the Public History Master's program. And I also am at the Women Leadership Archives, also mostly doing research. And we should mention Erica Christie graduated, so that's why she's not here today.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to just provide a little bit of an introduction to the project so you understand kind of how it's made up. The Sesquicentennial Timeline, which is now titled the Loyola at 150 Student Life Timeline, began its journey at the beginning of the last academic year and has evolved through a creative, focused collaboration between the Sesquicentennial Scholars and the archives of both the Loyola University Archives and Special Collections and the Women in Leadership Archives. The only goal in the beginning was to create a project that celebrated 150 years of the university. And since there were already several digital examples of the history of Loyola as an institution, the first step was to come up with a new approach. The archives had been looking for an opportunity to exhibit on student life, and the larger Sesquicentennial Committee had become excited about the idea of having a digital timeline that showed the connection between the university and the wider world. So the two ideas were merged into the basic structure of the project that we're presenting to you today. In creating a creative and structural plan for the timeline, we decided that in order to show the connections between what the students were doing, what was happening in Chicago, and the events of our nation and beyond, it was best to divide the timeline into decades and then choose themes for each that both represented that specific period in time and demonstrated the connections between our chosen groups. Those decisions were not made easily or lightly. Choosing the decade themes meant considering what was happening in both local and global societies and how the students of the university were getting involved in major issues both on and off of campus. We tried to show not only how the happenings of the city and the world affected the students, but how the students got involved and how their actions made a difference to others. The scholars are divided between the two archives, as we mentioned in our introductions. So all the research done in both was put into a common spreadsheet that was accessible to everyone, including the archivists. The four of us met to decide what events would actually be in the timeline. We each tried to choose things that were at the same time unique to the school and or the time period, relevant to the theme, and or what life was like during that specific period. Our goal then as a group was to pare them down and just keep the events that were most, which best represented each decade. We originally intended to have the timeline finished by the end of this month, but as you know, due to the time and access setbacks we've encountered during the pandemic, that's proven to be impossible. So unfortunately, it is still very much a work in progress, but we think that so far it's turned out very well, and we're proud to be creating a project that will be of interest to alumni, students, and anyone interested in the history of collegiate life.
Thank you, Jennifer. So now I'll take us over to the site. So I escape from the slides for a bit. If it lets me do that. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I will be walking us through the rest of the site later, but I just wanted to share a bit about the decision-making process behind our choosing the platform and the tools we are using here. So when considering the platform for our project, we had initially wanted to go with Scala as we liked its very streamlined interface. However, upon further discussion with the library staff, we decided to go with Omeka S, which is what you're seeing in front of you on your screen now, as that was the platform they were most familiar with. And this was to ensure that our project could be maintained even after we had graduated. We also considered several timeline tools, and we chose Timeline.js, which I'll walk us through later. We chose this because it was one of the easiest to use, and it also looked visually appealing. In addition, it allowed us to group events by categories to show interactions between students, and the larger events in the world. So now, let me just walk us through the site. So you can see here we have the header, and we have several headers at the top that we tried to word in as action-oriented terms as possible, so users could know immediately where to go and where to navigate to once you're on the site. So we have also drop-down menus to make everything just look visually cleaner. And there's a short write-up on what the project is about. And just below, we have thumbnails that lead to individual decade pages. So I'm going to bring us to the 1870s decade page. Okay. And on each decade page, there will be a picture of the decade photo so that people can find out more about the metadata if they wish. And we also have a blurb that orients readers to the kinds of themes they can expect to see in this particular decade. And just below that, we have a drop-down menu with instructions on how to navigate the timeline. And we also have a link where users can click on if they wish to see all the media from this particular decade. And this is where Timeline.js comes in. So we have a title slide, and as it might be a little faint here, but we have 4 categories, and each event is categorized to one particular category here. We have world events, institutional history, student life, and Chicago events. And when you click through the timeline, you'll be able to see an image, and you'll be also able to see a link here that will bring you to the metadata for this particular image. And my colleague Scarlett will talk more about the metadata aspect of this project later. We also have the date of the event, and we also have links to external sites where you can find more information about particular events. And there's a short write-up here to kind of explain the image and what the particular event is about. And navigation can be done through arrow keys or by clicking on the buttons. And just to provide a rather kind of seamless experience from one timeline to the other, we also decided to include an ending slide that would be able to bring users to the next decade page. Or they could always choose their own adventure and go up to the timelines at the top and choose a new decade that they want to go to. So you might have realized by now that there were quite a lot of steps involved in this, and this actually came about as a result of usability tests that Scarlett, Jennifer, and myself conducted over the course of the summer. So I'm going to bring us back to the slides now. Now, for those of us who are not familiar with usability, with digital humanities, usability testing might be a kind of a new term. So what it essentially means is essentially an opportunity for us to find out how users interact with a web project. And we conducted 2 rounds of usability testing. The first was with friends and family, and the other one was larger, which was tested with a new pool of friends and family, as well as the library staff. Users were asked to give feedback on the landing page, perform a series of tasks, such as navigating to different pages and scrolling through the timeline. And based on their experiences, we made changes to the site. And after we made changes from the first round of testing, we had a second round of testing and we got more feedback. So we made more changes. It's an extremely iterative process. And for all of us on the team, usability testing was an extremely insightful process. For instance, we worked on the site for several months without once realizing that we actually lacked a header. So the header that you saw earlier was a pretty late addition. We could also observe how intuitive site navigation was for users, and it was very humbling to hear our users complain to us about how some things were set up. I'll now share some of the key changes that we made. So the first thing was the site navigation. Omeka S was actually set up in a way such that when you click on a thumbnail, it wouldn't bring you to a page. It brought you to the metadata page instead. But that's not what most people, including ourselves, expect when we click on a thumbnail. So to get around that, we adapted some CSS code to make the thumbnails clickable. But then when we did that, we realized that everything looked pretty good on a web browser. But when it came to a mobile interface, it was disastrous. The images were chaotic because the original CSS code we had used was not responsive, so it would not adapt across screen sizes. After being alerted to this by one of our users, we looked around for another code and thankfully got it to work. And a third change that we made for this was actually to add decade titles. Previously, we just had the year, which was kind of boring, not as interesting as having a title that gave you an idea of what the theme was. And that was also something we added based on user feedback. And you might have seen the timeline earlier. We had user feedback that it was easier to know if there was a hyperlink if we underlined it. Previously, we had just told users to hover their mouse over the headline to find out if there was an external site link, but we quickly realized that was not too intuitive, so we changed that. The last key change that we made was born out of our own discussions. We realized that having instructions on every single decade page looked chunky. So previously, what you see on the left was what every decade page looked like. And so we thought that that might be a bit too visually unappealing if we kept that for everything. However, we were also concerned that having instructions only on the first decade page might mean that users who skip the first page wouldn't know what to do. We so decided to look into the possibility of a drop-down menu, which is what you see on the right. And this was thankfully able to be done due to generous contributors who had made their code available online. So that's how we were able to get to where we are today. And now I'll hand the time over to Scarlett.
Thank you, Regina. So a significant part of our work in our respective archives was research. Both the University Archives and Special Collections and the Women in Leadership Archives. My role at the WLA was specifically to research events for student life at Mundelein College, which was the women's college next door to Loyola by the Lakeshore campus. Student life at the two schools overlapped quite a bit, and Mundelein affiliated with Loyola in 1991. So we felt there was a natural reason to include Mundelein student life as well in the timeline. In both archives, we drew from a range of materials that you'll see throughout the timeline, including student newspapers, yearbooks, department files, scrapbooks, and photo collections. Previous exhibits that both archives had made were very helpful in guiding our research, but we also wanted to focus on images and media that had been used less frequently or even not at all. So for I think we can go to the timeline now, maybe the 1930s. For events that we didn't have materials for, we were able to locate public domain images from sources such as the Library of Congress and Smithsonian. So that was immensely helpful. So this is a great example here of a piece from the Library of Congress. But the 1930s are a great way to see the mixture of Mundelein and Loyola student life. So if you go, I think, yeah, perfect. The first debate between the two schools. In order to view all the metadata, every time we decided to use an image, we recorded detailed metadata into Omeka. And you can either click on the image or click on the little underline under it, and it'll bring you here. And this lists where it's from, what the description is, a date as close as we could get, which archive, how to cite it, and various subjects. So we can also search for media by subject for anyone who's interested in music, for instance. You can search music and it'll bring up everything that we have on the site. And then all the way at the bottom is a link to the full image so you can see it in its original size. And so, yeah, so this was part of like the background work of the project, but we wanted it also to be available for users. Let's see. Oh yes, so now not everything that we were able to find fit neatly on a timeline. Student life often shows a lot of change over time, and so we decided to dig deeper into certain topics that seemed really relevant. And the way we did that is through exhibits. So here are a few of them that we have, and we'll go to music. So these allowed us to dive into a media and other things throughout the years and really engage with the topic and present all the really fascinating things that we found about the way that student life has changed in surprising ways over the years. So you'll see a range of media again, and the exhibit format in Omeka is really useful for integrating images into the sort of storytelling of the exhibit. We also, moving forward, once we have physical access to files again, we're looking forward to making more exhibits on World Wars I and II and student life, as well as Vietnam War protests on campus, and some other ideas we have in the works. All right, so moving forward, I think back to the slideshow. Because of our limited circumstances with remote work, we decided to also put some of our effort into some other projects that were feasible with what we have currently. So at the WLA, I proposed a project for an oral history project, which we then designed as a team, the whole staff. So the title is Share Your Story, Student Life at Mundelein. Oral historians are creating a lot of advice for doing Zoom interviews online right now during this quarantine period. So we were able to find a lot of great guidance, and we've been doing these interviews with Mundelein alumni via Zoom. We've done a number of them, and they've been really great so far. And that was sort of the pilot group. So now we're going to be opening up a second round of a call for interviews starting sometime this month. So we plan for it to be in time for each class's 50th anniversary, which would be really neat to be able to produce something for them to sort of a sort of media project in time for that. So that is another project that we've been doing. It would have been 90 years of Mundelein College this year, as well as 150 of Loyola. So it was a neat anniversary to start. And I'll toss it over to Jennifer now.
Just quickly, a couple of things that they're doing at the Loyola Archives. They're trying to help promote the timeline and the 150th anniversary on Twitter. So we're doing 150th facts every week that include tidbits from the timeline. So, and trying to get even more images and other things kind of incorporated into what we're doing. They're also doing LUC 150th tweets every week. So if you want to find out any more fun facts about the university, there's 2 other opportunities. And I know that the archives is also doing some other digital exhibits to go along with the anniversary. So there's some more of those things that will be coming out in the near future. And I think that's all we have. Formally.
Okay, thank you. Would we like to turn it over to the Q&A portion now, or is there anything more you'd like to say?
No, I think we're ready for the Q&A.
All right, then I will enable the chat if anyone would like to post in chat. Also, hello, I'm Andrew French. I'm hosting and moderating this. If you want to post in chat, I can read the questions then to the presenters, or otherwise you can use the raise your hand function on Zoom, if you know where to find that. I think you click participants and then you can do that yourself. Oh, I see we got one from Owen.
Hi, I had sort of a technical question. So I'm familiar with Omeka. I'm familiar with the timeline software. Did those two things integrate really well, or did you sort of have to develop those two aspects side by side and then make the timeline appear, or put the timeline into Omeka after the fact?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So it was actually very easy to integrate the two. I think for Timeline.js, they had a code that allow us to embed the timeline into Omeka.s, and Omeka.s allows you to embed things in HTML. So that was rather easy for us to do. And thank you for reminding me, we actually had workshops for everyone on the team to get up to speed on these technologies, because not everyone had the same level of familiarity with these tools. And that was also partly why we chose these two tools, because they worked well together and were easy to use.
I have a question from the chat asking, is the timeline live and can we visit it?
No, it is not right now. It won't be up and available until we get it finished.
But I'm sure it will be announced when it is live.
Yes.
Okay, another one from chat. Someone says they would like to check out the Turtle Derby. I too was very interested in that.
Yes, the turtle derbies are fun things. It was a 50s thing on both campuses, so it was fun.
Should we do a little screen share to show the photos?
Sure, I love it. Okay, so that might actually be one of our favorites. Okay, oh. Can I get there? Okay, so I don't suppose we will have time to read all the text, but we did find these very interesting images in the archive. So this was by, I think, the Wasserman Biological Society. So they had all these images of turtle carapaces and then details of when the match would be. And it seemed that the turtles were sometimes obtained from a soup company. So the turtles were saved from another purpose. That was great. And then this was at Loyola, and we also found something at Mundelein. So both colleges appear to have the turtle derbies going on, and members of the public would also be able to watch this. And I think sometimes they were quite confused as to what was going on. And Scarlett, do you want to share a bit about this great find of yours?
Yes, so in the Mundelein student newspaper, there's this lovely article where apparently it rained very hard the day before the turtle derby, and several of the competitors were washed away. And so if you found a turtle, you could feel free to keep it, but they still had this turtle, I think one other, and they still competed, so this was the winner.
And it wasn't just a Loyola thing. They had it, it was the national competition or regional competition was in Detroit one year. So it was a major deal.
I will also mention that early, like back in, I think, March or April, when the Kentucky Derby would have been, they instead held the Kentucky Turtle Derby. And the video is on YouTube if you want a very entertaining thing to watch.
Okay, so I'll stop sharing for now.
Sorry, I was muted. Prakriti, yes, I saw your hand.
Yeah, thanks. Really cool website, very neatly put together. So kudos to the team. Mine's a very specific question to the timeline. Did you all have multiple spreadsheets for each timeline? Was there a way to have one master spreadsheet and then break this timeline down into smaller chunks by decade?
Yeah, so thank you for your question. We had a master spreadsheet initially when we were putting the research that Jennifer and Scarlett were talking about. And then from that master spreadsheet, we chose the events that we wanted. And for each individual timeline, we had to create individual spreadsheets. And so the 1870s will have its own spreadsheet, 1880s will have its own spreadsheet, but we had a master spreadsheet to kind of keep track of everything that was going on. But that was not linked to Timeline.js.
And I thought I saw another hand. I'm not sure if, oh, Liz, yes.
Hi, this is fantastic. So my initial question was going to be about like what kind of strange or interesting, find did you stumble across? But I think that the turtle sufficiently answered that. So instead I'll ask, like, in looking through all of the archives, like what have you noticed or learned about student life at Loyola in terms of like what's changed or maybe what's remained the same? Just any kind of like lessons or like, moments about student life that you could share with us?
Well, I'll go first. It's interesting to look at especially since we chose to look at it by decade. It's interesting to look at how student life is both the same and different. Where you look at the 30s and there's always some sort of rebellion going on in some way. There's always some sort of, against authority, and it was much more obvious in the 70s. They had a campaign to get the vice president fired called Sink the Chink. So it was a little more crazy. But there's kind of similar things going on just because I guess the people are all the same age. The major exception would be like World War II. Things were definitely not, as usual during that period. But yeah, there's been some really funny things that you just don't expect, especially when you get back into like the 1870s and 1880s. People painted completely in white, pretending to be statues. And just some interesting differences in culture between the different decades for sure.
I can also add that seeing the change over time was really fascinating. I think I read through the entire run of the Mundelein student newspaper from like 1931 to 1959. And then it kind of ended, there's no explanation, but watching the way that students interacted with the world was fascinating, starting out in this very like, we have a newspaper, like very excited kind of thing. And then by the time you were in the 50s, it was, half the newspaper was fears about communism. And what do we do as students? And it's wild to watch that change. And also how much stays the same, like Jennifer said. There's always, photos of people at events and things like that feel very familiar in a way. So yeah, it was a fascinating time.
Yeah, I think for me, I was very fascinated by the change in format of the yearbooks because we rely a lot on the yearbooks to kind of get our research. And the yearbooks in the decades, I think up to the 1950s or 60s, they were incredibly detailed. The language was beautiful. And when you read it, you're like, wow, I wish we did yearbooks like this, but they would be like sprawling 100-page yearbooks with lots of detail. And sometimes students would also pen poems. And that was very interesting for me to see because I think now for yearbooks that we have, it's a lot of images, but sometimes you kind of want to know what people were thinking about, what they were talking about. And so having that text was really helpful. And one other thing that surprised me was the kind of value placed on sports at Loyola. I did not realize that the school had placed a lot of emphasis on sports because they thought it was a very crucial part of Jesuit education. And that was quite surprising to me because I always thought that, for physical act requirements ended when you went to college or even high school. So it was surprising to me to see that that was part of the curriculum, and students actually had to take some gym credits, and they could take horse riding classes, which is very cool. So that was a fun thing to find out.
All right, looks like we have another question from Theodore.
So this question is for any of our explorers. Right now, the Loyola Phoenix has been in the news in the controversy over the arrest and the photographing of student protesters. There came a time when the Phoenix was born because the original student newspaper, I think it was called the Loyola News or something like that. Anyway, did you guys get a chance to explore that controversy, and are there any similarities to what's going on today?
The paper changed so much over time, depending on what was going on in the world. There was a noticeable change, just I think, like Scarlett said a minute ago, where editors changed and you noticed a lot more world events and how students were responding to those world events, where it had always been kind of dances and social events and clubs and things before. So there's definitely change, and then there were decades where it went back and forth. In the 60s and 70s, it definitely became much more political, and covering those things and how that was affecting the world became a bigger deal. It's kind of moved forward and retreated several times over the years, depending on, you know, how major the effect of what was going on in the world was to the students. So I think you can kind of see some pushing forward and falling back in many places over the years.
I wonder if you mentioned, you know, exploring the Vietnam War more in future. I just wonder if there was some connection there, that things got a little too hot politically and the Loyola News demised and the Phoenix had to rise from its ashes.
Good question. I haven't been able to get to the 70s yet because of the shutdown, but I can let you know after I get there. But that's a good question to check that out.
Okay, real quick, we have one question from chat. They ask, I would love to hear about how you decided on world events or Chicago events to feature. Was there general agreements or disagreements?
Sure. So what we did to our process, we had that master spreadsheet. And as we did our research, we would each fill in items that we felt might be relevant. And then we would all meet to go through the list. And we had a set number of events. I think it's 30 events per decade. And so we had to get a balance of student life events and institutional events to outside events. And then once we narrowed it down, we would debate the merits of including one event or the other. You know, how much emphasis do we put on the Chicago World's Fair versus some of these other inventions that decade? So it was a process, and I think we still have some decades to work through because we have plenty of world events, but because of access issues, we haven't been able to balance them out yet. But that's a great question. It took a lot of back and forth, and there were times where we got into a decade and then decided we should probably swap out some events. So.
Okay, I see another hand from Francis. Oh, you are still muted. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, good. Just a partial answer maybe to Ted Karamansky's question about the history of and the migration from Loyola News to the Phoenix. My recollection of what happened was that the Loyola News in those days reported directly to the administration, and the administration was insisting that they not cover this or they don't do something else, you know. And so the students got very frustrated and in effect closed the Loyola News and opened the Phoenix with the notion that that would be one that they would control. They might have an advisor, but that they were a free and independent newspaper in a way that the Loyola News had not been.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I'm excited to get into digging into the sources and everything. That's feels very relevant to today. And I think there's also another question in the chat.
Yes. It's asking, did you find big differences between the activities at, did you find big differences between the activities at Loyola and Mundelein? Were there traditions for either that got ditched when they came together?
I think there was one that got ditched. I think, but this was way before Mandela and Loyola came together. There was this thing called the push ball contest. There was a giant ball. Students had to push the ball across, I think, a line at the end of the field. I think it might have gotten a bit too vigorous. So I think that was discontinued around the 1960s. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jennifer. But you see these great archival photos of students like going on a little victory march around Sheridan Road. And then they'll have this barrel that showed that they had won. And I believe the pushball contest was only between the freshmen and the sophomores. So it was a big deal for those classes, right? But they discontinued that around the 60s.
Yes, there were, I mean, the Mundelein and Loyola shared a lot of events. Their dances and other, like the debate that Scarlett talked or referred to earlier, they did work together on a lot of things. And they had their own separate traditions too. And, you know, whether those ended necessarily with the coming together of the two schools, I'm sure some did, but I think a lot also just petered out over time naturally. And some were, you know, things that were, I think the older the schools got, the more they combined those things also, so that they had joint organizations and that type of thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how the two schools were gendered at the start. Mundelein being a girls' school, and Loyola, the Lakeshore campus, was mostly male students for a long time. So it was like, well, when they wanted a mixed choir, they would bring over the girls from Mundelein. And also during World War II, they had very few students at Loyola, so they combined choirs again. So there was a lot of, in our oral histories, we're finding that a lot of the Mundelein students would occasionally go hang out at the Loyola Student Union. There was a lot of mixing, but also there was still a very distinct school spirit. The Mundelein, I think they were often called like Mundel bundles and things like that. They kind of brushed it off for the most part. And yeah, the sort of genderedness eventually broke down towards the end. So they collaborated on radio stations in the 70s that the students would run and perform on and things like that.
Yeah, and just to add on to the genderness thing and about performing arts. So it turns out that sometimes the drama club at Mundelein, they had to perform mainly at night because that was the time when the male students from Loyola would be free and they needed male students for those roles. So rehearsals had to happen after hours so both school students could meet.
Okay, another question from the chat asks, are you thinking about doing outreach to particular departments or programs? I feel like the music program now would be very interested in your research into the music history of Loyola and Mundelein. It actually might be useful in how current faculty, staff, and students understand and tell their history.
I can talk about this one. So my latest exhibit that I was working on was the dance one. And we found that none of the dance materials had been digitized. So we had no access. And I reached out to the head of the dance department, who it turns out actually founded the dance department. And so she was able to point me to a lot of really interesting information. And university marketing also was very helpful in their digital photo archive of allowing us to access it and use their photos. And she was thrilled that anyone wanted to know the history. And then she started putting me in touch with other people as well. So I think that it's just happening naturally, and that it will be a really good chance for the institution to know its history better. I found that a lot of the department websites of things like dance and drama and music didn't really present their history very much. So this is a great sort of student-centered way of doing that with, I mean, a lot of really great photos. So yes.
All right, do we have any more questions that anyone would like to pose? Oh. In the chat, just a note, as primarily commuter schools, both Loyola and Mundelein students took public transportation to/from school. Many marriages occurred after meetings on buses and the L.
I can add to that. One of the oral histories I did, the woman met her husband because there were Mundelein and Loyola students hanging out, and he drove her home, and they found out they had the same birthday.
Well, that's fascinating. That's really funny. Any other questions from anyone? Anyone typing anything in chat that I might have missed? Okay, well, thank you so much. Any final words?
If we don't have any final words from the presenters, I just want to thank everyone for coming. And this was our first, lunchtime lecture talk via Zoom, and I think it went well. So we really appreciate so much the time and the effort that was spent by our presenters to put together an engaging presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. This was actually quite lovely, much better than I sort of expected for the format. And I hope that all of you will consider coming to our next lunchtime lecture, which will be in 2 weeks, with Seth Perlow from Georgetown University, talking about more on the textual studies side, handwriting analysis. So thank you again to all our presenters. I echo Ted in saying very much looking forward to exploring the timeline and the site. I think it's wonderful. So thank you, everyone. And it was very lovely to see many of you and just to sort of know you're out there.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.